Okay, we're going to be looking at the bones, the skeletal system, which is made up of organs called bones, and our skeleton is actually divided up into two parts called the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So you notice that we have headlines here in our structure list, parts of the axial skeleton, and so when we say axial skeleton, we're actually meaning the skeleton that kind of runs in the central part of your body. And we'll give an example of this. Looking at this picture, we see that the green area of the skeleton, which kind of runs in the middle of the body, including the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs, and the sacrum, is all in the axis or the middle of the body. Then what's attached to this, whether that be the clavicle, the scapula, the limbs, the hip bones, called the os coxae, then we call that the appendicular skeleton. So we are going to start out with the axial skeleton, and the first part of the axial skeleton is the skull. Now the skull itself is not just one bone, but it's actually several bones. Those bones are actually divided up into what we call the cranial bones and the facial bones. So anyway, these are the names of the actual bones of the skull, and so you're going to be responsible for knowing these bones, what they look like, and then we will look at a couple of processes or specific areas on the skull bones. So first of all, let's look at the skull bones, then we'll talk about a couple of specific areas on the skull bones. So the bones we're going to look at first are the frontal, occipital, temporal, and parietal. We have a couple different images, one that's more of a two-dimensional colored image, and the other which are pictures of actual models. But let's start out with the colored images first and kind of orient ourselves. So the first bone we will look at is the frontal, which is basically this area here, which is the bones of the forehead. Looking at it from the front or anterior side here, we see the frontal bone. Okay, the next thing is the bones on kind of the top of the head, which is the parietal bones. And then looking at it again from the front, we see the parietals, which in this picture we really can't see very well. They would be behind the frontal bone. So again, notice how the parietal bones are behind the frontal bones. And the parietal bones actually attach to other bones with lines called suture lines. For instance, this is called the squamous suture. This is called the coronal suture right through here. Okay, then we have this bone called the occipital bone, which is in the back of the head. And finally, we have this bone kind of where your ear would sit and on the side of your head, called the temporal bone. So again, looking here, we can see the frontal bone here, and we can see a little bit of this very, not the purple area, but this area back here is part of the temporal bone. We can see part of the parietal bones right here, which is literally behind the frontal bone. Notice we also have a PowerPoint PDF slide that also talks about the bones of the skull. And again, here we categorize them into the cranial bones. These bones are considered cranial bones, kind of the bones that encase the head and the brain lies under it, versus the facial bones, the bones that kind of make up the facial area of the skull. Again, we can see the frontal bone here in the forehead region. We can see the parietal bones, which is behind the suture line right here, kind of on the top of the head. We can see the occipital bone here in the back of the head. And then we can see the temporal bone here, kind of in the side of the head. Of the skull, I should say. Looking at this, you can see an individual frontal bone with the other bones removed. And you're going to see some other terms on here because these are the same slides I used for my Bio 141 class. So if it's not on your list, you don't have to know it, but it doesn't hurt you to see it. But what you're going to basically need to know is the bone itself, not necessarily the parts of the bone, unless I specifically tell you that. Okay, well, here we see the suture lines. Here's the temporal bone, that bone that's on the side of the head. And again, you can see there's a lot of parts on it, but you basically just need to know the temporal bone. Here on the lower part of the skull, in the back of the skull, is the occipital bone. And notice one thing you are going to need to know is this big hole, because that big hole is really important, because we know that the spinal cord is going to run up to that hole, and then the brain stem starts after that hole. And since the spinal cord and brain are continuous with each other, that hole tells us where the brain stops and the spinal cord begins. Okay, so again, we're going to continue with the bones that you need to know. So let's go ahead and look at we've looked at the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital, which is actually not on this list, but it should be. So just remember, occipital is one of those cranial bones. But what we're going to look at next is the sphenoid and the ethmoid bone. Now, the sphenoid and ethmoid are kind of surrounded by other bones, so you need to kind of know what they look like by themselves and kind of what their location is with the other bones around them. So let's look, first of all, individually at what those bones look like. The sphenoid bone is what I like to call the bat bone. You can see it has these areas out there here that we actually call greater wings. Greater wings. We have these areas in here. They're called pterygoid processes. I like to call them the bat's feet. We even have an upper wing here that's called the lesser wings. But just kind of remember the sphenoid by itself looks kind of like a bat. Then that will help you remember that. The ethmoid bone is a really unusual, kind of blunt shaped, unique shaped bone with, you can see it has holes in it because there are sinuses in this bone. And this kind of sits in the nose region, but with a lot of different bones around it. So here we can see it. You can kind of see it from a side view with this being the anterior portion, and this being the side portion, this being the back portion, this being the inferior portion, and this being the superior portion. Now this area right through here actually makes up part of the orbital of the eye. This area through here is actually seen up through the nose region, and this area right through here is actually going to be in the brain region. So I know that's like, well, wait a minute, I can see part of it from the eye, part of it from looking through the nose, and part of it from looking down where the brain is setting. So you can see it is definitely surrounded by a lot of other bones. So let's see if we can kind of see where it's at with the other bones around it. This is a disarticulated skull, so we can actually see the individual bones of the skull kind of separated from each other. And so the ethmoid bone is right here, and we're kind of looking up through what would be the nose region if we're looking up through this area. But if we were to take the skull cap off, called the calvarium, and look down on it, we would see the kind of top of it. And then if we could see this with the other bones, then the side of it would actually be right here in the orbital of the eye region. So this is one of the disadvantages of looking at something two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, but hopefully you can still get an idea of where these bones are at and what their shape is and kind of, what they're connected to. We look kind of in the orbital or the eye socket area right here. Then the side of the ethmoid bone, we can see part of it in this picture right here, that red area. You can see it says ethmoid bone. If we were to look in this way, then this area right through here is also the ethmoid bone, the sides of it. But if we looked up the nose region, then the specific area here, the middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone, then we're seeing part of the bone looking up the nose, part of the bone looking in the back of the eyes, part of the bone is lying beneath the nasal bone. And then the last area that we would want to look, the brain would sit in this area right here, and then this portion of the ethmoid bone actually has an area called the crista galli, which is not on your list, so you don't have to know it, but it's got this area called cribriform plates. And so this is the frontal bone right through here, the kind of the goldish area. But this little area right here, the frontal bone kind of sits and connects around the ethmoid bone. And so those little holes right there is actually what allows olfactory nerves to run up and stimulate the brain so that you can have a sense of smell. So the ethmoid bone does play a part in your ability to smell. And of course your brain is lying on top of all this right here. And then of course your skull and the cranial bones in particular are protecting the brain. Okay, the sphenoid bone, the bat bone we talked about, we can see the outline of it here and here, all the way out to here. This area through here is called greater wings. This area up through here is called lesser wings. And again, the sphenoid bone, or what I like to call the bat bone. And of course, we can't see the feet of the bat on this side because it would be underneath. So let's see if we can see that. Okay, here I'm going to outline the sphenoid bone right here. And this is looking, of course, in the inferior perspective of the skull, but this area right here and this area right here is actually the bat's feet projecting back at you. Now again, that's again a weakness of the two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, but the bat's feet would be on the inferior perspective of the sphenoid bone or the bat bone. But notice how also part of the bat bone, those greater wings actually protrude up in this region. Let me kind of show you from here. So here's kind of the greater wing protruding up, and then down through here, that's part of this, where the bat's feet would be down on this side. So again, sphenoid bone surrounded by a lot of other bones also. Okay, continuing where we left off. So we've seen the frontal bone, the occipital, the temporal, the parietal, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid. So the last two we want to look at that are actually bones before we get to some of the parts of those bones is we want to look at the nasal bones and the zygomatic bone. Now nasal bones, I bet that's pretty straightforward. That's going to be those bones at the top part of your nose that is the hard part of your nose, whereas the bottom part of your nose is still made out of hyaline cartilage, but the top part used to be hyaline cartilage, but it ossified into bone, and those bones are nasal bones. So you can see the nasal bones here. You've got a right and a left nasal bone. Okay, but then the other bone that we want to look at is actually the cheekbone, the zygomatic bone. So you can see the zygomatic bone here and the zygomatic bone there. You can also see both the nasal bone and the cheekbone from a side view. Again, there's the nasal bone, the upper portion of your nose, that hard portion of your nose. Then here's the good example of the zygomatic bone, which connects to basically to the frontal bone in the upper portion. It connects actually to the temporal bone on the side, and it connects to a facial bone we'll talk about later called the maxilla in the front. Okay, now the next thing is the nasal conchae, which we actually have an inferior nasal conchae, which is a bone, and then we have what's called a superior and middle nasal conchae, which is actually part of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so let's just talk about the inferior nasal conchae since it is one of the skull bones. Again, if I'm looking up through the nasal region right here, notice that I've got the inferior nasal conchae, this green area, and that area over there, which is an individual bone. And then I've got the middle nasal conchae, which is right here, which is actually part of the ethmoid bone. So again, since we're just looking at the whole bone, this is the one you're responsible for, that lower bone on the inside of the nasal region. Now this region right here in your cheekbone area, but this region right here where the zygomatic bone and a protrusion off of it, actually called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and then this protrusion off of the temporal bone called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, these two things come together to form what's called the zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic arch is not a bone, but it's where two processes from two different bones come together and form this arch that actually literally has a space underneath it. So you can see zygomatic arch has the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because the process is the projection off the bone, and the zygomatic process tells me that this process is attaching to the zygomatic bone, but it's coming from the temporal bone. Therefore, the temporal process is coming off of the zygomatic bone, but going to the temporal bone. So the whole thing is called the zygomatic arch. Okay, the next area is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And if you actually tap on this kind of hard area behind your ear, you'll be tapping on that mastoid process. Let's look at that. So looking at this temporal bone, your ear would sit right here. Notice this kind of hard protrusion right here, this kind of rounded protrusion, not the sharp one, but the rounded protrusion right here, which you can literally feel if you tap on your skull behind your ear. That is your mastoid process, but it's from the temporal bone. Okay, we already mentioned the foramen magnum, that large opening in the occipital bone, and again, that's where we can define the difference between what's considered spinal cord and what's considered brainstem. And everything above that hole is considered brainstem until it becomes the other parts of the brain. Everything below that hole is considered the spinal cord.